The morning my grandfather was buried, I wore his favorite color, navy blue. He always said it was the color of people who meant what they said. I thought about that on the drive back from Meadowvale Cemetery, watching the Ontario fields blur past the car window. And I thought, I am going to need every bit of that today. My name is Maya. I'm 31 years old. I work as a freelance graphic designer out of a small studio apartment in Hamilton. And for the past 6 years, I've built something that is entirely mine. My client list, my reputation, my savings. I did it quietly, without asking anyone in my family for a single dollar, because I learned early that money given by my family always came with a lock on the door. My grandfather, Roy, was different. He was the one person in my family who saw me clearly. He used to say, "Maya, you're the kind of person who finishes what she starts." He left me a card on my 25th birthday with $200 cash inside and a note that said, "For your future, not for theirs." I kept that card. I still have it in my desk drawer. When he died in September, quietly in his sleep, the way good people sometimes get to go, he left behind a house in Ancaster, a modest RRSP, and a handwritten will that his lawyer had filed 3 years earlier. I knew about the will because he had told me about it himself, sitting at his kitchen table over tea, the winter before last. He said he was leaving the house to be sold and divided equally among his 4 grandchildren. He said he wanted us each to have a real start. My share would have been somewhere around $68,000. I say would have been because by the time the estate lawyer called me in November, the will my grandfather described no longer existed. The call came on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just finished a rebrand project for a bakery in Dundas, and I was feeling good, that specific quiet pride of completing something clean and honest. My phone rang, and it was the lawyer's office, a woman named Patricia, and she said she needed me to come in to discuss the estate. Her voice had a careful, neutral quality to it that I recognized immediately. It was the tone people use when they are about to tell you something that will change the shape of your day. I sat down without meaning to. She told me that a revised will had been submitted, signed, dated, and witnessed approximately 14 months before my grandfather died. In this version, the house was to pass entirely to my uncle, his son. The RRSP had already been transferred. The 4-way split my grandfather had described to me over tea did not appear anywhere in the new document. I asked her to repeat the date. 14 months before he died. My grandfather had been in the early stages of a dementia diagnosis. He had told me himself, carefully, that he was having trouble with paperwork. He had said, and I remembered this with perfect clarity, that my uncle had offered to help him get his affairs in order. I thanked Patricia and hung up. I sat at my desk for a long time looking at the bakery logo I had just finished, a simple, clean thing I had built from nothing. And I thought about what my grandfather said about navy blue, people who mean what they say. I did not cry. I had already spent years crying about my family. What I felt instead was something colder and more focused. I opened a new document on my computer, and I started writing down everything I remembered. The drive to Ancaster for the post-funeral gathering took 40 minutes. My mother was already there when I arrived, along with my aunt, 2 cousins, and my uncle, who stood in my grandfather's kitchen like he had always owned it, refilling people's coffee and accepting condolences with the warm, practiced ease of someone who had already decided how the story ended. His name is Dennis. He is 54 years old, my mother's older brother, and he has spent most of his adult life making slightly too many promises. Growing up, I watched him borrow money from my grandfather at least 3 times. I watched my grandfather forgive him each time because that was who Roy was. Dennis knew exactly who Roy was. I accepted a cup of coffee and I watched Dennis move around that kitchen, and I kept my face perfectly still. My cousin, Dennis's daughter, pulled me aside near the back door and said, quietly, that she was sorry about how things had worked out with the estate. She said her father had been managing Grandpa's finances for the last year, and that it had been a lot of work. She said it almost gently, like she expected me to nod and let it go. I said, I'm sure it was. She looked at me for a moment, then went back inside. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anyone that afternoon, was that I had already made an appointment with a different lawyer, a wills and estates litigator in downtown Hamilton, recommended to me by a colleague who had gone through a contested estate 2 years earlier. Her name was Adrian, and when I called her office that morning, she had asked me 3 questions and then said, "Come in Thursday." I stayed at the gathering for 2 hours. I helped wash dishes. I hugged my grandmother's old friends. I said thank you when people told me Roy had been a wonderful man. Because he had been. And because saying it out loud felt like protecting something. When Dennis walked me to my car, he put a hand on my shoulder and said, he wanted to make sure the house stayed in the family, kept it simple. I looked at him. Of course, I said. That makes sense. He nodded, satisfied. He had the expression of a man who believed the hard part was over. I drove home and added that conversation to my document. Adrian's office was on King Street, 3rd floor, with a view of the escarpment. She was in her late 40s, precise and unhurried, and she read everything I had brought, my notes, a copy of the original will Patricia had sent me, my grandfather's diagnosis timeline from the family doctor, and 3 text messages my grandfather had sent me in the months before the revised will was supposedly signed, in which he had mentioned being confused about paperwork and had asked me twice if I remembered what he had told me about the house. She set everything down and said, "This is not an unusual pattern, and it is not an unwinnable one." She explained what we were dealing with, a potential claim of undue influence, possibly combined with testamentary incapacity. She said the timing of the revision, 14 months before death during an early dementia diagnosis, with Dennis acting as the person helping manage his finances, was significant. She said the witness signatures on the new will would need to be examined. She said there was a process, and that the process existed exactly for situations like this one. I asked her what I needed to do. She said, gather everything. Bank records showing any transfers in that 14-month window, any medical documentation, any communication from my grandfather, texts, cards, emails that showed his stated intentions, any witnesses who had heard him discuss his estate plans. I thought about my grandfather's neighbor, a retired teacher named Colette, who had lived next door for 22 years and who had eaten Sunday dinner with my grandfather almost every week. I thought about how my grandfather used to talk to Colette about everything. I called Colette that evening. She answered on the second ring. When I explained what had happened, there was a long pause. Then she said, "He told me last Christmas what he wanted. He was very clear. He said he had already made sure it was set up right." She paused again. He said Dennis kept asking to see the paperwork and it made Roy uncomfortable. He mentioned it more than once. I wrote that down too. The next 3 months were the most methodical work I have ever done. I am a designer. I think in systems, in structure, in what belongs where. I applied every bit of that to what I was building. I filed a formal challenge to the revised will through Adrian. I submitted my grandfather's medical records to the court, which confirmed that his dementia assessment had begun before the date on the revised will. I submitted Colette's written statement. I tracked down the 2 witnesses on the new document, both of them connected to Dennis, and one of them, under questioning, admitted she had not actually been present in the room when my grandfather signed. She said she had signed afterward, at Dennis's request, because he had told her it was just a formality. I want to be honest about what that felt like to learn. It felt like the floor shifting slightly, the way it does when something you suspected turns out to be real. It wasn't a surprise exactly. It was confirmation. And confirmation, even of terrible things, has its own terrible steadiness. Adrian told me we were in a strong position. She said that witness testimony combined with the medical timeline and the financial transfers, Dennis had moved $22,000 from my grandfather's savings account in the months after he took over the finances, gave us a clear and documentable picture. I asked about my other cousins, the ones who had been cut out along with me. My cousin from my other aunt's side, a quiet guy named Patrick who worked in Guelph, had no idea any of this had happened until I called him. He cried on the phone. He said, "I just thought Grandpa had changed his mind." I said, "He didn't." Patrick joined the challenge. So did my cousin Simone, who lived in Vancouver and who I hadn't spoken to in 2 years, but who responded to my email within 40 minutes with the words, "I'm in. Tell me what you need." There was a mediation session in February. I drove to Toronto on a gray Wednesday morning and sat across a table from Dennis for the first time since the funeral. He had a lawyer with him, a tired-looking man who shuffled papers with the resigned air of someone who had reviewed the evidence and understood the situation. Dennis himself looked smaller than I remembered him. He kept glancing at his phone. At one point, he said, "Dad would have wanted to keep things peaceful." I looked at him steadily. I said, "Then it's a shame he wasn't given the chance to say so himself." His lawyer touched his arm and he stopped talking. The mediation did not resolve everything that day, but the direction was clear. By March, Dennis had agreed, through his lawyer in writing, to a settlement. the house would be sold. The $22,000 in transferred funds would be returned to the estate. After legal fees, each of the four grandchildren would receive approximately $51,000. It was not the $68,000 my grandfather had intended, but it was what he had intended in spirit, and it was real, and it was ours. My mother called me the night after the settlement was confirmed. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said she wished I had talked to her before going to a lawyer. I said I had tried to call her the day after Patricia's call. She didn't remember that. She said Dennis was going to have a very hard time financially now. I said, he made those choices, Mom. She said, he's my brother. I said, Grandpa was my grandfather. We didn't talk for a few weeks after that. It was hard, and I won't pretend it wasn't. But there is a difference between hard and wrong, and I have spent enough of my life confusing the two. Colette sent me a card in April. She had written inside, Roy would have been proud. I put it in my desk drawer next to the birthday card he gave me 6 years ago. For your future, not for theirs. I used part of the settlement to pay off the last of my student loans, the ones I have been quietly chipping away at for years. I put $30,000 into a TFSA. I used the rest to upgrade my studio setup and take on a client I had been too financially stretched to say yes to before. A small Indigenous-owned clothing brand out of Winnipeg that needed a full identity system built from scratch. It was the best project I'd worked on in years. Patrick sent me a message in May. He said he'd put his share toward a down payment on a house in Guelph, the thing he'd been trying to do for 3 years. He said, I keep thinking about how close I came to just believing it and moving on. I know that feeling. I spent a long time in my life believing that keeping the peace was the same as doing right. My grandfather used to drive to a farmer's market an hour away every Saturday morning just to buy peaches because he said the local ones tasted like effort. He was a man who thought the extra distance was worth it for the real thing. I am his granddaughter. I think that too. There is something I want to say to anyone who might be listening to this and recognizing something in it, who has been told that making noise is the same as making trouble, that pursuing what you're owed means you're greedy, that family loyalty means absorbing whatever is done to you without complaint. I want to say, those are not the same things. They have never been the same things. My grandfather built what he had, slowly, carefully, over a lifetime of work. He wanted it to mean something when he passed it on, making sure it actually did. That is not greed. That is respect. The navy blue dress is hanging in my closet right now. I've worn it twice since the funeral. I think I'll wear it again soon. If this story sounds like something you've lived through, or something you're living through right now, I'd be glad to hear from you in the comments. And if you know someone who's dealing with a contested estate or a family situation that doesn't feel right, share this with them. Sometimes the most useful thing is knowing someone else found their way through. Take care of yourselves out there. I'll see you in the next one. I used to think that letting things go was a form of strength, that absorbing what was done to you quietly without making noise meant you were the bigger person. I carried that belief for a long time, and it cost me more than I can easily measure. What happened with my grandfather's estate taught me something I wish I had understood sooner. There is a meaningful difference between forgiveness and compliance. Forgiveness is something you offer yourself, a way of setting down a weight so you can keep walking. Compliance is something other people ask of you so they can keep taking. I had spent years offering one while being told I was practicing the other. The choices my uncle made did not happen in a vacuum. He spent years watching a kind man extend trust again and again, and he made a calculation that kindness could be converted into opportunity if the timing was right and no one looked too closely. That calculation was wrong, not because the world punished him dramatically, but because every choice we make builds the version of ourselves we have to live with. He will carry what he did. That is not a wish. It is simply how cause and consequence work in a human life. What I'm more interested in is what I learned about myself. I learned that patience is not the same as passivity. Sitting across that table from my uncle in February, watching his lawyer shuffle papers and avoid eye contact, I was not there because I was angry. I was there because my grandfather had worked honestly for decades and had said clearly what he wanted, and that deserved to be defended with the same honesty and clarity he had put into building it. Doing right by someone is not always comfortable. Sometimes it requires you to walk into a room that feels too large for you and stay seated anyway. I also learned that doing this alone would have been impossible. Patrick, Simone, Colette, they showed me that when you act with integrity, you tend to find other people who recognize it. Not always, not immediately, but often enough to matter. The people who stand beside you when the situation is genuinely difficult are the ones worth knowing. And I learned, maybe most importantly, that protecting what is yours is not the same as being selfish. My grandfather saved carefully and gave generously and trusted the people around him. Honoring that was not about the money. It was about saying clearly that his life and his choices deserved to be treated with respect, even after he was gone. Especially after he was gone. If you are somewhere in the middle of something like this right now, I want you to know that the discomfort of standing your ground is temporary. The regret of not doing so is much harder to set down. Find the right people. Document everything. Take the extra step. My grandfather drove an hour every Saturday for peaches that tasted like they were supposed to. He understood that the real thing is worth the distance. So do I, now.